Mirë se erdhën në Public Square, unë jam Ditmir Bushati. Bosnia and Herzegovina po kalon një prej krizave më të rënda politike dhe kushtetuese që prej marrëveshjes së Daytonit të vitit 1995, që i dha fund luftës dhe konfliktit të përgjakshëm, por me sa duket, nuk po arrin të sigurojë një funksionalitet të plotë të Bosnjë e Hercegovinës. E gjitha kjo erdhi si pasojë një vendimi të gjykatës që dënoi presidentin e serbëve të Bosnjës apo presidentin e Republikës Srpska, Milorad Dodik. Dodik po kërcënon me një lëvizje shkëputëse të Republikës Srpska nga Bosnjë e Hercegovina dhe me një minim të plotë të autoritetit të ligjit dhe funksionimit të institucioneve ligjzbatuese në Republika Srpska. Dodik gjithashtu i ka bërë thirrje serbëve të Bosnjës që të bojkotojnë të gjitha institucionet në nivelin kombëtar. Çfarë po ndodh me Bosnjë e Hercegovinën dhe cili është impakti në çështjet e sigurisë për të gjithë rajonin? Si po sillen fshinjet në këtë situatë të re? Cili është qëndrimi i Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës dhe Bashkimit Evropian, të cilët vimësisht kanë bërë thirrje për ruajtjen e integritetit territorial të Bosnjë e Hercegovinës. Si po sillet Rusia dhe aktorë tjerë, por cili është dhe pozicioni i disa prej vendeve anëtare të Bashkimit Evropian që kanë kultivuar marrëdhënie preferenciale me Milorad Dodik. Për gjitha këto, do të flas sot me Sabina Ćudić, deputete nga Bosnjë e Hercegovina. Dear Sabina, welcome to Public Square. It's a great pleasure to have you talk about the recent developments in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is Bosnia and Herzegovina facing one of the biggest constitutional, political and security crises, or it is something quite normal that you can live with it?
The short answer would be yes. The long answer would be yes, but no doubt that we find ourselves in a very deep constitutional, political crisis with security ramifications, potential consequences that stem from these conditions, unfortunately brought upon mostly by one person and a short kind of small circle of people surrounding him. But as you said, let's talk about phenomenon and not necessarily as individuals, and how did the system allow for such amount of power to be exercised or abused and used by particular individuals. I will not, of course, bore you with a history lesson in Bosnia and Herzegovina's politics, but I will say that we have one of the most complex consociational structures that stem from a peace agreement, Dayton Peace Agreement. And I will also remind you that peace agreements don't necessarily highly value or prioritize functionality. Of course, they prioritize stopping war. And the fact that the peace agreement stops war effectively sometimes comes at the expense of a functionality of a system, creating a sort of a Frankenstein, or what I would like to say, more of a dinosaur sometimes, you know, the type of dinosaur with an incredibly small head and brain and incredibly large body. And in many ways, peace agreements sometimes tend to mirror these extinct creatures. Such is the case with the Dayton Peace Agreement, that's based on very complex power sharing mechanisms that allow in its structure for power to be abused, because it stipulates very strictly participation of Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, while excluding, in many instances, as proven by the European Court of Human Rights, others. And this has been used and abused by ethno-nationalist elites, I would say very successfully over the past decades. And now we see essentially state captured by an individual who is, and this is something that we've seen in Bosnia and Herzegovina repeatedly, when a person is accused of a crime, they associate themselves with the entire ethnic group and say, this is not an attack on me, this is an actual attack on the entire ethnic group, which then initiates constitutional crisis where we can't, unfortunately, distinguish ourselves from from the ethnic group we belong to, and we successfully use and abuse that system.
Why he's selectively attacking state institutions? So I mean, he's mostly attacking prosecution, state security agencies, but not necessarily tax authorities. What's your view?
Because these are the institutions that authoritarian regimes historically tend to attack first. Because it is once you attack the foundations of judicial system, once you attack the foundations of security system, then essentially a state can't function. But as you rightly pointed out, it is actually the distribution of funds. Interestingly enough, SNSD, the party from which Milorad Dodik comes, came to the state institutions in the middle of this crisis and voted for the state budget. So a person who says we are seceding, we are leaving the state institutions, adopts legislation that says that it would be illegal for representatives of Republika Srpska to come to work, which they continue to do so, coming to work. It's now illegal for them to come to work, and we are withdrawing from the state. And these same people, the same political party, comes to the Council of Ministers and votes for the state budget. That portrays a couple of things, that proves a couple of things. Number one, which is factually proven, is that Republika Srpska, part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, occupying 49% of the territory, is in a dire, incredibly difficult financial situation. I come from a party that's a member of the state coalition, and we find ourselves, although I initiated the reconfiguring of the state coalition while kicking out SNSD and Milorad Dodik, most of negotiations that I participated over the past 2 years, and there are numerous negotiations, really the only thing that SNSD, Milorad Dodik's party, was interested in was distribution of funds between two entities, state funds, because of the incredibly difficult situation that he's in. Just in the last 2 years, he visited Putin 7 times. 7 times. I mean, one can imagine that Vladimir Putin is quite busy man in this moment, and particularly busy over the past 2 years, finding time to meet with Milorad Dodik, who essentially went to ask, yes, for political support, but mostly for money and Russian grants. Tells you that, A, the level of desperation, and we know that desperate people are sometimes ready to take desperate measures, and in that process are capable of endangering the entire system, and, you know, by jumping into the abyss, also demanding that entire ethnic groups jump together with them. And now we are waiting and analyzing and carefully observing whether that will be the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
He has been speaking also about the new constitution for the Republika Srpska. Something that, according to my analysis, goes a little bit beyond what we are discussing together. Is it doable? I mean, is there any consensus within the Republika Srpska to go in that direction, or is just Dodik trying to do that? How serious he is on that?
There is absolutely no consensus. There is no consensus within Republika Srpska. There is no consensus on the national level. The loudest people are not necessarily the most powerful people. Milorad Dodik's majority in Republika Srpska's government relies currently on 5 people. 5 people in the entity assembly. So we are not talking a large majority. Actually, now it's down to 4, but I don't want to go into the kind of nitty-gritty details, and that shouldn't be of concern, of course, to our listeners and viewers. But what I'm saying is sometimes people portray themselves as having incredible support. Even, you know, during this crisis, his calls for employees from Republika Srpska who work in state institutions not to go to work has been met with a wide-ranging boycott. At the same time, the opposition from Republika Srpska, maybe for the first time in the past 30 years, distinctly and very, very concretely says, we are not following him. They will be introducing legislation in the assembly, Republika Srpska's assembly, abolishing the legislation that he introduced. And they are every day calling for boycott of his decisions. So there is, and also I will remind you that the opposition from Republika Srpska, the difference in votes with SNSD, it's a couple of tens of thousands of votes, not to mention with the wide-ranging, recorded, absolutely documented by OSCE, documented by the American Embassy, election fraud. So even within the election fraud, the majority that SNSD has is rather slim. So yes, there is a lot of game of smoke and mirrors that, of course, we see in politics all around the world. It's not unique to Bosnia and Herzegovina. But when the country faces constitutional crisis, and that crisis and the peace relies on a slim majority, very slim majority, of a person who at the same time is seriously analyzing scenarios of escape to Hungary or Moscow, then we really need to be more responsible and serious in answering to that and kind of living up to this moment.
Taking into account the fact that he has a slim majority, he's not being followed by the opposition in the Republika Srpska, and he's facing also resistance coming from ordinary citizens that are not following his advice or his orders to boycott institution at the national level, the state level. Do you see a room for reforms in Bosnia and Herzegovina to go beyond Dayton? I know that in the panels we've been together, but also when listening to you in different events, you have always advocating for a different Bosnia-Herzegovina, and to be honest, my impression is that Milorad Dodik is not the only one being frustrated with international presence in Bosnia, although his reasons might be very different from your reasons or from the reasons of honest and credible politicians in the country. But what's your view?
There are security implications of this crisis, despite the fact that it is an opportunity, this crisis. It also is perceived as an opportunity, of course, but by those who would like Bosnia and Herzegovina destabilized to the point where it serves as a distraction from their own personal political problems. And so when envisioning the darkest scenarios, it's not necessarily a scenario of 1992 with Yugoslavian National Army's tanks rolling into the country, but it's a scenario of incidents that may escalate. We are a country that is still, unfortunately, dealing with the collective trauma of the past war. And people are sensitive, and in that sense, that's a dangerous concoction. But speaking of international community, you're absolutely right. Majority of people are in some shape or form, for various reasons, oftentimes mutually exclusive reasons, frustrated with the activities of the international community. Some because they wished for greater involvement of the international community, for stauncher involvement, for more clear-cut involvement, some for lesser involvement. Then the decisions, as you know, we have very specific positions that no other countries in the region have, having the special representative with wide-ranging powers of intervening in the system, changing laws, suspending individuals. This is something that not many politicians or political systems or citizens, even in the region, let alone Europe, experience. So, for example, when a high representative imposed the law criminalizing genocide, denying, then, of course, there was an uproar and there was another crisis and boycott coming from Republika Srpska. At the same time, when he imposed, for example, certain legislative changes and structural changes allowing for the formation of this government, the uproar was by those who remained excluded, and so on and so forth. So there is a wide-ranging frustration with the international community. I will, however, have to say that our judicial system has been set up with the help, tremendous amount of help by the international community and with the involvement of foreign judges who really, truly did secure objectivity in the approach to key cases relating to war crimes, and of course, what is in the jurisdiction of the initially of the National Court with the presence of the foreign experts, and now in the Constitutional Court. So are we mature enough of a democracy to function fully without international involvement? Of course, it would be politically opportune for me to say absolutely yes, but that is not the case. That is not the case while we are dealing with it. And I see potential for the involvement, for example, so-called bone powers of the High Representative to intervene in the system as potentially complementary. Why were they introduced in the first place? Because once you reach a stalemate in the system, then that intervention allows for deblocking a system whose primary purpose was, again, to stop the war and not to be the most efficient democracy in the region or Europe. We are not efficient. We have, and I'm sure many of your listeners know this, but it's worth reminding them, we have 14 governments. We have one national government, two entity governments, 10 governments stemming from the cantons in the federation. We have the government in Brčko district. So that's not an efficient system. However, it is a system that, again, initially stopped the war.
Speaking about security ramifications, what has been the position of EU4 in the recent developments?
Well, of course, our experience of, at least in the 90s, of American approach to the region and European approach differs vastly. The approach differed vastly, and of course, there is when the EU4 took over from NATO, there was a worry among citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, although, of course, it was a symbolic badge change. It wasn't a kind of profound change in the security arena. But considering our experience with security guarantees, for example, coming in protected zones by the UN and so on, there was, of course, skepticism whether they have the capacity to answer to security challenges. And I do have to say that skepticism, unfortunately, remains. And what most people in Bosnia and Herzegovina would like to see is higher level of security guarantees. We do find ourselves, I don't need to remind you, of course, and it's a severe understatement to say we find ourselves in geopolitically peculiar times. And that's another element of this crisis. Whether this crisis will be felt by citizens the same way if it was happening a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I'm quite sure they wouldn't. But when everything seems to be up in the air in terms of relations between the EU and the United States and the ramifications of those relations in the Western Balkan region, of course, worry us. But every citizen in Bosnia and Herzegovina, agreeing with me or disagreeing on various issues, knows one thing, that the security situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina has huge ramifications for the entire region. A person who is bringing into question peace in Bosnia is destabilizing every single country from Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, with the potential, of course, dragging Croatia in as well. So we are both a solution and a source of concern for the entire region.
I couldn't agree more with you. What's your view about the position of US, going a bit beyond the statements and declarations I've seen? Maybe you have more info on that.
I will give you a small example of the relationship that Dodik's government had with the United States, and I would argue continues to have. When you go for negotiations in the building in Banja Luka of the Republika Srpska's government, they thought it would be funny to have American flags on the doormats where you clean your shoes, together with the pictures of the American ambassador. So that was the demonstration of vulgar force, or what they perceived to be force, of course, futile attempt to demonstrate force against the United States. And he used every single speech to speak against the United States. And he thought that that would change radically, considering his ties to AfD in Germany, which, of course, Dodik openly celebrates, his close, and the only actually truly close ties that he has in Europe with Mr. Orban. And he was very enthusiastic about the arrival of the new administration. However, he perceived it as a kind of tangential relationship where, by the sheer fact that he's close to AfD, that he's close to extreme right-wing forces, that he's close to Mr. Orban, that somehow that favor will translate immediately into support for Republika Srpska. However, the situation, as you know, is more complex in the region. We have Aleksandar Vučić as a player who, judging by the recent press conference that he had with Dodik, and continues to have series of meetings and so on, that situation is not as, that relationship is not as clear-cut as it seems. And there was always this competition of who's closer to Mr. Putin and kind of who's the bigger Serb among the two of them. So in the situation that we have now in Serbia, in Belgrade, with the protests, and the situation, that the crisis that we have in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but more also importantly, with a renowned sense of urgency in Europe and understanding that Russian threat is not solely coming through Ukraine. The Russian threat to destabilize, and Russia is not seeking cultural influence in Western Balkans. Russia is seeking distraction, destabilization, and having another pawn in the chess game. So he understands that he finds himself between a rock and a hard place. Rock being Europe, and potential hard place being the United States. And in this desperation, as I earlier said, desperate people make desperate decisions that have potentially tragic consequences for a greater number of people. So I think his optimism about the US is unfounded. I don't think that the Dodik has the capacity to receive that amount of support that he was hoping that he would simply be showered by, for the sheer fact of despising the previous administration.
And where do you see European Union in this respect? You are a candidate country. I know also the hurdles you have gone through for the growth plan, and also for the appointing a chief negotiator. But when you speak with EU officials, they are, I don't know why they are so proudly saying that this is the biggest office ever in Europe and in the world. But how this is being translated into tangible results for Bosnian and Herzegovinian citizens, I really don't know. So how do you see the progress of Bosnia and Herzegovina in this respect?
I personally, to begin with, I'm delighted to see Europe growing some spine. So I think it's a necessary and an important side effect or a result of the geopolitical situation, peculiar situation we find ourselves in. And with the growth of that spine, hopefully an understanding that policy of ignoring or appeasing is no longer, or never did, if you ask me, produce results, particularly not in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region. And in that scenario, I was speaking once in Berlin years ago, at the very onset of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And, I was saying, I understand how high the consequences are of engaging with Putin directly in Ukraine. Nuclear powers engaging always carries incredible amount of risk. Of course, conflict spreading throughout Europe, and I understand the careful considerations and analyzing every move. But Milorad Dodik, with controlling 49% and not even controlling, considering how slim the majority is, 49% of the territory of an incredibly small non-nuclear power, is an entirely inconsequential individual. And if Europe can't exercise power in those instances, then it's clearly sending a message. If we can't, digest a tiny cookie, how are we to digest, a wild boar that situation in Ukraine requires? So in growing spine, I would expect Europe to actually have stauncher requirements from Bosnia and Herzegovina, not treating us as a special needs case, not treating us and not seeing progress where progress is not impressive enough. Or in that sense, I would paradoxically want them to demand more of us. So everybody kind of stands up to the line. We are all theoretically pro-European Union, but actually many aren't, including Dodik. So in that sense, I would hope that this reinvigorates the EU path for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but in terms that are actually now fully realistic, with the red lines clearly drawn where they need to be drawn.
The way how the war in Ukraine will end, in my view, will have immense consequences for the whole European security architecture and also for our region. What's your analysis when you are confronted with different scenarios of ending that war? What would be the consequences for Bosnia and Herzegovina, for Kosovo, or others in our region? I'm asking you because in the past you have been quite vocal in opposing land swaps and border changes in the Balkans.
Border changes and land swap, in my opinion, in Western Balkans inevitably would lead to war. Simply empirically, what the outsiders sometimes perceive as elegant solutions on the ground when it comes to Western Balkans are never so elegant. And, what's perceived as a kind of highbrow, I see it as a highbrow ethnic cleansing, essentially. And we see it in the situation of Turkey and Cyprus and Turkey and Greece. And we see that these things have lasting, centuries-long consequences and continue to haunt generations of people. If we treat people like a video game, it can be, from above, from a kind of helicopter perspective, it seemed like an elegant solution, but on the ground, again, it never is. So what we need to find is solutions within given structures and to identify the forces that actually on the ground deliver what they promised to deliver, without putting on rose glasses that Brussels is sometimes, when convenient, very good at putting on rose-tinted glasses. For Ukraine, unfortunately, ever since the beginning of the invasion, I thought that there is a high chance that it ends in some form of Dayton II, meaning freezing or securing territorial integrity, but with the heavy Russian influence in freezing the front lines and securing semi-autonomous territories. I think that would be a mistake. That would be a tremendous mistake because, again, it creates decades of trying to unravel or reform a system that in itself carries a detonator. I see more opportunities for Western Balkans in this scenario of peace finding in Ukraine than risks.
Thank you so much, Sabina. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.